So now I want to explain a little bit about what this experience is all about. So as I was saying, before the universe was created, as far as we know, there was no time and there was no space. There was a big void. Of course, the void wasn't completely empty. People say that absolutely nothing existed. And we can't say absolutely nothing existed because the potential for everything that does exist had to exist in this empty void. Otherwise, everything that does exist now, including you and me, wouldn't be able to be here. So the way it's described then is we could say the unmanifest or the uncreated potential for everything that exists now existed in that void or in that emptiness. And then when there was that leap from formlessness to form, from timelessness to time, from being to becoming, from nothing to something, a process was initiated, and then the potential for everything that existed in the unmanifest state began to take form, began to become manifest. And just very briefly, it's important to understand, and I'm sure most of you are already aware of this, that the big discovery of evolution, especially from the perspective of consciousness or interiority, is the fact that we seem to be going somewhere. You know that in the early Greeks and people in the East, a lot of very brilliant people in the East today still don't really believe, haven't really caught up with the discoveries of Western science, and they don't really believe that we're going anywhere. In the East, and also in the West, it used to be believed that time went in cycles. So cycles mean circles. It would almost be like if you were on a merry-go-round and you were going around and around the same circle, and you always come back to the beginning. It starts all over again. And so, for example, in the East, they believe that time went in cycles or circles, and once you went through the predictable cyclical pattern, you came back to the beginning, and it started all over again. That's why in Eastern Enlightenment, the people who realized this said, well, I don't want to keep going through this birth and death and birth and death and birth and death. And I've been through this rigmarole hundreds of millions of times. I want out. I want free. It's like being in a bad marriage. So they say, I want to be free from the time process, free from the creative process, free from all. I want to get out of here. I don't, other because I see this as being trapped and being in a prison. But of course, we've discovered, and now we know that in fact, the creative process doesn't go in cycles or circles, but it's going more or less in a straight line. I mean, if you stand back far enough from the process, you'll actually see that it's going somewhere. And how do we know that it's going somewhere? Well, because if you go back, if you go back 6 billion years ago, the universe would not be in the shape that it's in now. We have to see that that there was a leap from energy to light to matter, and matter had to go through a lot of stars and planets had to collide into each other to make more complex compounds that would make it possible for life eventually to emerge. And unless a lot of these processes occurred, the conditions that would make it possible for life to emerge wouldn't have happened. But when the conditions in which made it possible for life to emerge occurred, then guess what happened? Life emerged. And then what is so extraordinary about life? Well, is the capacity for interiority. Consciousness is interior. Consciousness is the experience of the interior. So in other words, I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. But what we're sharing is our interior right now. So an integral philosophy tells us that for every exterior, there's an interior. And so what's the most extraordinary thing about life is this capacity for interiority in the creative process itself just emerged in this very dynamic and extraordinary way. And then as the great Jesuit priest Teilhard de Chardin pointed out, as life forms become more complex, as the brain gains a greater capacity for complexity, simultaneously the capacity for the experience of interiority expands in accordance with that. And the greater degree of complexity, more and more interiority. And so why this is so important is because when you start to realize that your experience of interiority, which is your experience of consciousness, cognition, you could say emotion also, but your experience of consciousness and cognition, emotion, all of your interior experience. And you notice your experience of interiority can at times be very small and contracted, and other times it can open up and become very, very expanded. And the more your experience of interiority expands, you seem to be able to include or become cognizant of, or more and more aware of, more and more of the cosmos, right? So when your experience of interiority is contracted into your, into your ego, one doesn't seem to be aware of very much except that. But when your experience of interiority expands, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Slowly but surely, eventually, there are moments and at times when it seems the one begins to cognize the entire cosmos, right? And once again, if you weren't here, if a sentient life form that had the capacity for that kind of expansion of consciousness and cognition didn't exist, then the energy and intelligence that initiated the entire creative process wouldn't have the capacity to bear witness to itself. It would exist, but it wouldn't be able to bear witness to itself, which would mean God, he, she, or it, would not be able to bear witness to his or her own creation. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, he or she created the universe, but something changes, something very big, dramatic, awesome, unimaginable happens when the capacity to bear witness to the entire process emerges from within the process itself. And that's really what God is. So there's no really external God, right, in the old sense of what that means. But as human beings, as highly evolved sentient beings, gain the capacity to bear witness to the creative process, then what happens is the energy and intelligence that's driving the process and initiated begins to become aware of itself, becomes self-aware. That's when whatever we want to call God actually emerges and becomes actually tangible. Now, why this is so important right now is because we all know that there is something greater than highly evolved human intelligence that's necessary for us to find the inspiration to take the next step and to do whatever it is that we have to do. Okay? What is going to be the source of our inspiration? Right? So either the source of our inspiration is going to be merely the impulse to survive, what I was speaking about before. But when you awaken to this godlike energy and this godlike intelligence, then your source of inspiration comes from the process itself. Then you literally feel yourself in touch with, awake to, and being driven by and animated by the same energy and intelligence that initiated the creative process. And that's what's driving you. That's what's turning you on. That's what gets you up out of bed every day. That's why you're alive. And so then what you discover is kind of a source of meaning and purpose and purposefulness that transcends the relative circumstances of your own personal life and transcends the relative circumstances of our global and cultural predicament. There's a sense of really being driven by the cosmos itself, or the same energy and intelligence that is creating it. And this is what's called a phrase or a term for this is called like a cosmocentric level of awareness.